It's the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert, coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. A week of protests and violent clashes with the police left almost 24 people dead and many others wounded in Nicaragua. Earlier this week, President Daniel Ortega withdrew the Social Security reform that had sparked the unrest and also promised to engage in dialogue with opposition forces under the mediation of the Catholic Church. At first, the demonstrations continued, but now seem to have died down. Exactly what happened and exactly who is responsible for the violence is mired in controversy. Each side blames the other, with some saying that the US government also played an important role. Joining me from Costa Rica to help shed some light on the latest developments in Nicaragua is John Kotula. John is a writer and artist who normally lives in Managua, Nicaragua. He writes for the blog NicaNotes, which is published by the Alliance for Global Justice. Thanks for being here today, John.
Well, thank you for having me.
So let's start with the situation at the moment. It seems that the protests have died down. Is that true? And if so, does this mean that Ortega's promise to withdraw the Social Security reform, which would have raised payroll taxes for both employers and employees, and his promise to engage in dialogue, that this had an effect?
I think the situation is still tense and complicated, but you're right that there is calm at this point. And it seems also that there's a consensus developing to solve the issues through dialogue rather than through violence. Last Monday, there was a huge march. Some say it was one of the biggest political gatherings in the history of Central America. And that march was completely calm and without violence. And I think that's given people an opportunity to express their feelings and express what they want to have happen without violence.
And what kinds of expressions were these? I mean, we know that the protests were initiated because of the Social Security reform, but it seems that they took on many other issues. And you're mentioning the protest on Monday. What were the main issues for the demonstrators on that day?
You know, I think those of us who were observing this were shocked by how rapidly the atmosphere in Nicaragua changed. And the initial issue seemed to be these changes to Social Security, but then it became the violence itself. And now there are a number of issues on the table, demands for freedom of speech, demands for a resolution to the initial issue, acknowledgement of the deaths that have happened, and there's the question of whether the presidency of Daniel can continue.
So just turning back again to the issue of the violence, in a report that you wrote for NicaNotes a few days ago, you mentioned that the clashes that you witnessed were not just between police and demonstrators, but also between different civilian groups. Can you tell us more about that and who might have been involved in these confrontations between civilians? I mean, was it possible to tell?
I think it's not possible to tell what happened at this point. There are many parties involved. There are very conflictual reports about who initiated the violence. There's even controversy about who the victims are. So I think all of that is going to, we're going to have to wait on all of that before we really have a handle on what happened.
Some of the footage of the violence that we saw in Nicaragua reminded me of protests that I've seen in Venezuela. Specifically, what I mean is that it was not just the police that at times reacted with excessive force, but the protesters too seemed to use lethal weapons such as homemade grenade launchers. What can you tell us about these kinds of violence that did take place? I mean, and you said already that it was too difficult to tell who were ultimately the victims. But what do we know and what kind of weapons seem to have been used, as far as you could tell.
There's been a lot of rock throwing. There's been a lot of Molotov cocktail throwing. There have been both rubber and live bullets fired. A lot of arson. Highways being blocked by burning tires. So a full range.
So talk to us about the political and economic situation in Nicaragua at the moment. On the one hand, there's little doubt that inequality has declined and poverty has been halved since Ortega took office 11 years ago. Also in 2016, Ortega won the vote with something like 72%. However, these kinds of widespread protests would suggest that the government is actually perhaps far more unpopular than one might have thought. What is your perception of Ortega's popularity at the moment, and how do you make sense of this contradiction between, on the one hand, a relatively positive economic performance and strong vote result in the last election, but on the other hand, these protests? What's going on? How do you make sense of that?
Well, let me say first off that I'm talking as a gringo. I'm a foreigner living in Nicaragua. I love the country, but I feel like I'm observing it from a very different lens than a Nicaraguan might be. And the thing that was most striking to me was the rapidity of the change. Before this, everything that you read about Nicaragua was positive. The safest country in Central America. I think everybody agrees that that's true. A growing economy, a very stable political system, free public education, free medical care, sort of a hip, cheap new tourist destination. And then overnight, that narrative completely changed. And what I was reading on social media was anger and vitriolic responses to this policy change. And some of it felt designed to fan the flames rather than to seek resolution. And I have, as an American, I have concern that the U.S. might have played some role in that. And it certainly wouldn't be a surprise given our history. And I just, as an American, I think we have to view all of this with the hard-won knowledge that U.S. interference in Nicaragua is never for the good. We've got a 200-year history of undermining what Nicaraguans want for themselves. And we can talk among ourselves and we can debate passionately, but it has to be with the knowledge that Nicaraguans make their own decisions. Nicaraguans are perfectly capable of running their own country, and U.S. intervention is never a good idea.
So is there any kind of evidence about the U.S. involvement this time around? I know that the House passed the NICA Act, which was supposed to cut off international aid to Nicaragua, and it is currently stalled in the Senate. Do you see any connection there to the protests that were taking place in Nicaragua recently?
I would certainly expect that the people who support the NICA Act would use this crisis to try and move that legislation forward. And you would think that Nicaragua would be the U.S.'s best friend in Central America. It plays a very minor role in any drug trafficking. Nicaraguans are not showing up on the US border. It's a safe country. The gang violence that has racked the Northern Triangle doesn't take place in Nicaragua. So you would think the United States would want to affiliate itself with Nicaragua, but instead we seem to be locked into this knee-jerk Cold War mentality that says any government that doesn't toe the line with neoliberal policies is our enemy. And I hope people will reconsider that.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there for now. I was speaking to John Kotula in Costa Rica, who writes for the blog NicaNotes. Thanks again, John, for having joined us today.
Okay, pleasure to talk to you.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.